Can you see? Can you see it? Can you see my presentation?
I can see it at least.
Okay, okay, thanks. Okay, first I'd like to express my sincere thanks to the organizer, Professor Lindenberg, for accepting my abstract, but even before that, for organizing this meeting, because it gives me the chance to combine it all together, the field of my research is Roman law, with a recently started interest in Indian law tradition. Certainly, it would have been very pleasant to meet in Sweden, but the fact that I'm COVID positive and feverish reduces some of the regret. I have to admit that my talk has a rather scary, obscure title. I would quote Molière, who used to say in a letter to his father after graduating at the law school in Orléans, that you have only to wear the toga as a lawyer, and all illogic becomes wisdom and all stupidity is reason. And as a lawyer, I can kind of confirm it. He certainly hit the nail on the head by expressing the ambiguity that intentionally or unintentionally comes from a legal vocabulary. So I think I need to have my goal clarified. The objective of this speech is to attempt to identify, after pointing out the material connections, some similarities between the law conceived by the Indian tradition and Roman law. And I selected a circumscribed period of time around the first 2 centuries AD. I would like to divide my presentation into 3 different sectors. In the first one, I choose some modern theories about comparative law families, while in the second one, I selected some proof of the material connection between ancient Rome and India dated around the 1st century AD. Moving then in the third part with the legal connection. I think it may be useful to start from the definition that the jurist René David, considered the father of comparative law, gave of this subject. As you can see, he focuses on what it has to be compared, such as the elements that can resist to later change. And it is with this view that I'd like to proceed. Modern comparative doctrine, in the process of reconstructing families of systems through classifications based mainly on historical reason and limited to private law, has always kept the Romanist model quite distinct from the Indian one, which has always been relegated to general and very heterogeneous categories. And then we can have a look at some examples. In this, for example, the Roman model is even hidden in the German one, while the Indian is an independent one. In this other categorization made by René David again, for families, and we have the Roman Germanistic, Indian is put in this general category of other system. In this other classification made by Zweigert-Kötz in 1984, Romanistic is independent, but India is again put in this general category. We have to wait until Mattei in 2006 that he makes an advance in categorization, dividing countries to how close or far they were from the 3 mechanisms that he thinks they govern society: law, politics, and tradition. So in the map, you can see how Europe in gray color is dominated by law, while India has a mixture of law and tradition. It is certainly not my intention to develop these theoretical classifications, nor to force connections that are difficult to imagine. Rather, it is to try to blunt somewhat the distance, not only geographical, that divide the 2 cultures in the jurist perspective. It must be said that the model seen compare the legal system as a diachronic outcome of their respective traditions. And India has a truly complex legal historical reality because, without going into too much detail, the influence of British law, and especially what for the British was to be considered Hindu law, erodes the classicism and the virginity of classical Hindu law. So, after submitting the abstract, I realized how ambiguous the locution of classical Hindu law might be, if not explained a bit. As John Main says in 1910, the classical Hindu law has the oldest pedigree of any known system of jurisprudence. But his point of view embraces a wider meaning of classical Hindu law, which is also the idea of it that colonists had. And they thought that it ended in only 1772, when Britain ordered to use in many sectors of the private law the traditional laws. And here you can see the official act about it. But for the purpose of my paper, I would stay strict to the general periodization made by comparative law doctrine, which, as you can see, circumscribes classical period between 800 before Christ to 200 AD. This period represents the time when Indian legal culture poured dharmas, that is a key term and to which we will return later, into writing in major legal works. After having pointed out these introductive aspects, I would like to dive in the past and focus directly on a few proofs on the contacts between the Roman and the Indian communities. Starting with Strabo, that we already mentioned yesterday, it is known that he visited the recently created Roman province of Egypt between 29 and 26 before Christ. During this journey, he got information about efficiency of ports of the Red Sea and especially of the port of Neos Ormus, and you can see it in the map. From where 120 ships every year sailed in the direction of India, and it is remarkable in the text the comparison between the actual time and Ptolemaic dynasty activity. The intensity of the trade was such that Pliny, in Book 12 of Naturalis Historia, devoted to exotic plants, species of India, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, inserts a scathing complaint against India, but also China and Arabia, even if China, I took the translation of Ceres, but after what you said yesterday, it should be taken carefully, with a clear moralistic intent. As you can read, he's worried for the huge amount of money spent in the Indian trade because of luxury of Roman women. However, Strabo's piece, due to the presence of such a high indication of ships, has given rise to a real debate about the intensity of trade between the Greco-Roman world and India. Though some doubts have emerged in doctrine, particularly about the difficulty of procuring or building ships in the Red Sea, and the impossibility of using ships commonly using the Mediterranean Sea to cross the Indian Ocean, I think that these doubts must be overcome. And some relations yesterday have already brilliantly pointed out this. Many other proofs can be adduced to demonstrate, on the contrary, from the Augustan age onwards, the soundness of the positions that support how flourishing trade was between the two realities. And I will limit myself to 4 sources, and 2 comes from literary tradition, and the other 2 are related to law. The first one, and I think you know a lot more about it than I do, it's the Periplus Maris Erythrae. This fascinating and mysterious piece, dated convincingly in the 1st century AD, and its authorship is attributed to an anonymous but highly educated Greek merchant. In this work are described the routes that were typically taken and alongside the ports of interchange in the area of Red Sea, Horn of Africa, to just India. In this fragment, the author speaks about the past, saying the ships did not go from Egypt to India and back directly, and from both directions, they were first to stop in Arabia, that for this reason was called Eudaimon, so pleased. But not only Western sources may provide clues. Tamil literature from South India has yielded a few passages which probably refers to Western merchants. So, in this second source, it comes from the Tamil poetic work Purananuru, that is the last of the 8 anthologies of Sanskrit literature, a huge collection of over 400 heroic poems, and the date is around the 1st century AD. If the Yavanas in this text can be identified as Greco-Roman merchants, which seems probable to me, this passage makes clear that the quality of their ships was almost proverbial in southern India. Tamils had a reason to admire the ships of the Romans, as there would have been a contrast between Mediterranean ships and native vessels. People in the Indian Ocean were familiar with the latter for centuries, while Western ships were still a novelty. And now we can move to the legal sources. The first is a piece of Marcianus, taken from the digest De Liber Singularis de Delatoribus, and in this fragment, the fragment contains a rescript of Mark Aurelius and Commodus. It was analyzed yesterday for the expression vestic serica vel subserica, if I remember well. And so we are around the 2nd half of the 2nd century, and we know these through some epigraphs found in Alexandria and Palmyra. and it is called among scholars the Alexandrian tariff. It provides an indication of the taxable goods traveling this route, including spices, ivory, hides, and silks. And as you can see, many items cited have direct or reasonable connection with Indian markets. But tracks of this import tax that testify the relationship between the two societies can be found also elsewhere, and especially in a papyrus. Papyrus Vindoboniensis Grecus, commonly called Muziri papyrus. This is an extremely interesting negotiation document that can be examined from multiple perspectives. It can be dated at around the mid of the 2nd century, although recto and verso are written by 2 different hands, and it deals with the shipment of goods from Egypt and India. The recto contains part of an agreement that covers the transport of goods from the point in the Red Sea where these had been unloaded, taking into account the Indian contracts, and thence down to Nile to Alexandria. The verso contains an account of amount of nard, ivory, and textile, typical India's exports, and the calculation of their value for customs duty. For sure, the account on the verso is related to the agreement of the recto, dealing with the same shipment of goods. But I will limit myself to 2 points of interest for my topic. The tax mentioned in the digest that we just saw, the vectigal, is probably the one mentioned in the rect of the papyrus, 25%, the tethartes, imposed as an import tax on goods from India. In fact, in line 8, it says, and I'm citing the entire clause of the contract, I will convey them, so items, downstream to the warehouse that received the duty of 1/4 at Alexandria. Then we have the line 12, where there is this geographical clue. It would translate it as on the date for repayment specified in the loan agreement at Muziris, that it was the major part of the southwest coast of India. And now I can pay some attention to the content-related juxtapositions between the 2 legal traditions. I've chosen to limit the scope of the investigation on the Indian side to the so-called Code of Manu, using the critical edition made by Oliver in 2005. So all translation comes from there. This book has been dated to 1st, 2nd century AD, at a time almost coeval with both the blossoming of classical jurisprudence at Rome and the writing of Gaius Institutiones. Even the Sanskrit name is meaningful because it mentions both Dharma and Sastra. Typically, Hindu collections of precepts are named after mythological and legendary names. But interestingly, Manava is the common name for human. So in the title, there is a double meaning, laws of Manu, but also laws for the human race. But now, before going on, I think that I should introduce the division between Dharmasutra and Dharmasastra. The first, the older ones, are written in the form of sutras, and they are the earliest written developments of Vedic literature. While the Dharmasastra, written after the Dharmasutras, these texts use a method verse and are much more elaborate in their scope than Dharmasutras. Dharma sums up multiple meanings, but at first approximation, we can translate it as legal practice, while Sastra means law, but also teaching. And it is perhaps in this second term that the profound meaning of the work is encapsulated, a religious book that inserts legal customs in a religiously connoted context. I decided to develop some very little consideration and hypotheses around 4 juxtapositions. The first involves the 2 keywords of both legal systems, respectively Dharma and use, while the other are more detailed aspects that for the few pieces of doctrine I examined, they were not too deeply analyzed nor compared. Starting with Dharma, in relation to the Latin use, it has to be said that starting from 18th century, the noun was badly misunderstood by British colonials who made the easy but also wrong equivalence between Dharma and law. Dharma is a noun with the suffix ma that still have some traces in Latin and Greek, carmen and reuma, and the root dar or der. The root expresses actions such as to hold, bear, carry. So Dharma is the way in which or the means by which one should hold, bears, carries, or maintain the way of doing things. And now we can also develop 2 different levels of interpretation of the term. On a cosmic level, Dharma is the way in which one maintains everything and the way in which the cosmos or the balance in the cosmos is maintained. While at the micro level, Dharma is the way in which every constituent element of the cosmos contributes its share to maintaining the overall balance. And to make some example of this last category, a person Dharma regulates all activities, whatever their nature. So he regulates the human relationship to the supernatural power, as well as he prescribes the rituals and ceremonies by which this relationship should be sustained. But to put it differently, Hindu law is, together with every other aspect of Hindu's activity, part of Hindu Dharma. So a first important consequence of the concept of Dharma is that in Hinduism, law, religion, and all other topics dealt with in the Dharmasastras are inextricably intertwined. Moving to etymology of use is still really controversial topic in doctrine. Many proposals have been put forward. The first derivation of use from justitia, as claimed by jurists like Ulpianus, Eubeo and Jungo to emphasize its prosectivity, or Jupiter to link its religious authority. Alongside these, a never entirely outdated hypothesis sees the term deriving from common Indo-European and then has traces also in Sanskrit roots. These ideas coincide with what have better emerges from other archaic and archaeological data and evidence. Use is both a legal and a religious or magical religious entity. The etymological problem remains open, alongside the fact that use was thus custom, tradition, we say mos, in its most strictly perspective aspect. However, about the intervening of law and religion common to both ancient laws, it should be noted that the Roman world is distinguished by the speed with which it dissolved. The distinction between law and the religion, with the consequent secularization of law, occurred as early as the 12 tables were written. In this opera, while preserving penalties in a religious sense, for example, the pena cullei, or prosecuting crimes of magic, malum carne incantare, the Romans gave autonomous prominence to the legal aspect as an essential and self-sufficient one. So we verified that from two similar origins, the legal tradition took two divergent routes in the respective history. And now, we can now move on to more specific aspects of private law. It is well known that Roman law does not contain fundamental notions such as subjective right or negotium. In a contractual dispute, the plaintiff didn't indicate what belonged to him, but what the defendant had to give or to do against him. So the emphasis is therefore on the defendant's behavior, his opportere, while the subjective legal situation of the plaintiff is quite elusive. Roman jurists, with their concreteness, realized that the true power due to the creditor was the actio. And for example, we have the definition of actio made by Celsus in the first fragment, that is the power to take legal action to obtain what was due to its owner. And then the mechanism of the process per formulas, who was the process used from the 3rd century before Christ to the 2nd century AD, facilitated this, since each favorable subject situation corresponding to a specific legal action. Moreover, the legal action, the actio, was not abstract, but was based on the actual existence of the subjective situation. Thus, to say that a person could act against an heir with the actio ex testamento for a legatum presupposed that he had toward that heir a claim to the performance of that legatum. In this other example, taken from Ulpiano's commentary on the Praetor Edict, the Praetor, and this is the context of this, is the background of this fragment, the Praetor granted an action against sailormen and hotelier who were liable for the removal to damage to the things entrusted to them, unless a vis maior occurred. So he gives an actio in factum that was honoraria, opposed to civil, so it wasn't recognized directly from the jus civile, but however, the expression aims to define a specific relationship which the Praetor deemed worthy of protection. So I gladly borrow a simile devised by my mentor, Professor Fagnoli, who imagines the process as a prism. Just as each phase has a corresponding and equal one, so each procedural action is the fruit of a single legal situation. Similarly, the Indian legal experience seems to me to adhere to a similar reconstruction. First of all, the regulation of relationships, civil and criminal, is found in Book 8 of the Code of Manu, which contains almost all the legal rules, with the exception of the family rules and the law of succession that are in Book 9. The 8th book begins, and I think it's significant, by establishing the king as the only subject with jurisdiction. However, the list of cases on which he can judge is circumscribed. The list which does not
Yeah, can somebody mute Eleftherios? There we go.
Okay, thanks. So the list, which does not appear to be illustrative but prescriptive, contains the 18 legal actions allowed to be developed in trials. And only these 18 actions are developed in detail in the book. Thus, apart from the fact that there is no definition of legal relationships nor of a transactional performance, it seems to be safe to say that, as in the Roman experience, the procedural perspective is the only way to have a personal legal situation protected also in the Indian tradition. And the order of the title of actions reflect the way of thinking of Manu. So from 1 to 10, there are the individual and group disputes. From 11 to 15, the stuff related to criminal law. 16 and 17 in purple, personal law, while in 18 there is kind of, we can say, public law or administrative law. I will not apply the category of jus privatus Romanorum to subsume Indian actions in the Roman actiones. I will merely point out that in the same period of time, and we are around 1st and 2nd century AD again, the Roman development of certain protection mechanisms, such as the emptio venditio, the sale without ownership, the contract of deposit as a civil action and no longer actio in factum, and the actio of division were also well known in India. It should be noted also that the category of consensual contracts, whose emergence in Roman law was more complex because of the volatility of the instrument of agreement, was also present in the Book of Manu, with the mention of the emptio that correspond to the revocation of purchase and sale, the societas, the partnerships, and I would say also the locatio conductio, because I will reconduct the dispute between the owner and herdsman to the locatio conductio. The alternative could be to reconduct to the mandatum, but in Roman law, both locatio and mandatum are consensual contracts. I also think it is remarkable that thefts and verbal abuse that are put in the criminal sphere in the legal actions could only be prosecuted following a private complaint and not for a public activity, unlike now. In Roman law, we can make this just up. In Roman law, we can say that they did the same, they worked at the same way, attribute theft, the theft that it was alternative furtum or rapina, or verbal abuse, inuria, to delicta and not crimina, whose main difference was precisely the private prosecution of the former. Even in the later collections, although the list of protected legal situation expanded and the order of the titles diverged remarkably, the procedural perspective remained the main one. It is significant that in the Narada Smriti, and it is about around the 5th, 6th century after Christ, which is considered the best made and more sophisticated law book because it focuses only in legal matter, the structure of the book followed the structure of the legal action listed in the Manu Code. We have 18 chapters as 18 actions, even if the theft that was an action in the, as you can see with the green arrow, it put in an appendix while the 18th title is occupied by the miscellaneous. And even more, there is an introduction that focuses only on procedural rules. And now I can move to two brief examples that show how well structured both systems were. On the subject of interest, Manu Code recognized the maritime interest rate, which, due to the high risk of the perishing of goods, could derogate from the ordinary interest. We can read the fragment when it said that one expert in sea voyages capable of forecasting profit with respect to particular places and times fix an interest rate, that is exactly the rate for the payment. We can see how the autonomy of the parties could set the interest rate without limit in the case of maritime transport. Roman law knew a particular type of a loan, a mutuum, Greek-derived fenus nauticum, but it was also called pecunia traiecticia, in which the periculum maris was an essential element of the agreement. As you can see from this fragment that comes from the Pauli Sententiae, the maritime loan, as long as navigation lasts, tolerates infinite interest for the danger assumed by the creditor, when it says infinitas usuras recipere potest. On the subject of interest, I would like to add that classical Indian law only comes to this development with the Book of Manu, because previously, in the various Dharmasutras, there was an absolute prohibition of lending money at interest higher than the legal rate, and it was punishable with the death penalty. And the reference is to Dharmasutra of Paudayana, where we can read that when a man takes a loan at the going rate of interest and then lends it at a higher rate, he is an usurer and he is denounced in all the code of law. Similarly, in Roman law, the mutuum, the loan, was but remained throughout the classical era a free contract with the exchange of the tantundem, so the same amount of money or of stuff, as is evident from the procedural formula, the actio mutui. As you can see, both in the intention, red, and in condemnatio, in green, there is the same amount of money, sestertium decem milia. Interest could be agreed upon not within the loan contract, but with an autonomous verbal agreement, the stipulatio usurarum. But it is interesting that the interest could not exceed the 12th of the value, reduced then by Justinian to 6, who kept the original value, the 12%, only precisely for the maritime loan. The second example is in the area of debts. There are cases in which the denial of the debt, later established before the court, caused the debtor to pay twice the value of the debt. Manu law recognized the seriousness of the debtor behavior, who, in addition to a fine, is forced to pay double the value of the debt. Thus, the re persecutoria and the penalis functions are combined in a single mechanism. We can read that if the debtor admits that he owes the debts, he ought to be fined 500, but if he denies, twice as much. That is Manu's decree. Roman law also recognized an aggravation of liability for a judicial party who is unsuccessful in a judgment and has resisted with gross negligence or malafide. The institutions of Gaius, we are in Book 4, Chapter 171, bring together various instruments to prevent these, and it is called the litigantes temere, that this is the title of the paragraph in the corresponding institutions of Justinian. The text of Book 4, 171 has been reconstructed by comparing it with Justinian's institution, because the codex, the palimpsest of Verona, is quite damaged, but it shows that the praetor had various punitive tools at his disposal to discourage those who knew they were wrong from supporting a judgment, such as a penalty or a oath. In addition, in some cases that are exemplified, the defendant was inflicted with the actio dupli, and these examples are the actio judicati, which arose from the pronouncement of the judgment of the courts and gave the condemned person 30 days to pay. Then we have the actio from damages, the actio de pensi, that is the recourse against the principal debtor for which his guarantor has paid, and the actio as testamento, in case of legatum with mandatory effects. Significantly, these examples are the same ones that Gaius used to describe cases where both the re persecutoria and penalis functions are pursued, as in the case of the Book of Manu. And now an example taken directly from Otto Lenne's reconstructions of the Edictum Perpetuum. This is the actio legis aquilium adversus inficiantem, so against the person who denies the debt. The actio legis aquilia reserved for those who had suffered the killing of a res mancipis, such as a slave. It was used in case of killing of res mancipis, such as a slave or an animal. The sentence was to be proportioned to the maximum value that, in the example, the slave had reached in the previous year. So we can read quantis sticus servus in eo anno plurimi fuit. However, in case of denial of responsibility, the clause of condemnatio dupli was added to the formula, as you can see in red, tantam pecuniam duplam. I am aware that many reasonable criticism can be leveled at this presentation. Many others could have been the insights and links and source used. I would have liked, for example, to explore the social religious reasons that inspire these rules, or to have researched any documents of practice direct and indirect evidence of trial activity in the 1st and 2nd century in India, or to expand the analysis to the other laws collections of books. Therefore, although the divergence probably outweighed the similarities, I only wanted to show that besides the undeniable trade and maritime connection, as far as the instrument of laws is concerned, the Brahmin editors and the Roman juries offered similar solutions. We know that in South American colonies, during the 14th and 15th century, one of the first things that the conquistadores, the Spanish people took was the corpus juris civilis. So who knows if among peacocks, slaves, emerald, and oils, also law books were also transported. Thank you for your time, your attention, and I'm open for suggestions that you'd like to address. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great presentation. Can you take down the screen? Thanks. Yeah, that was great. Any questions? Here we have Ran already. Xiao Yang. Okay, Xiao didn't. It was an applaud. Okay. Sven, would you like to pose a question?
Yes, thank you very much for this rich and very nice presentation. I have a question regarding the foreign elements coming into law, and especially the idea of legal fiction. So can you observe this also in the non-Roman legal sources, and how is it dealt with? So how is the disturbing element, so to say, integrated into the legal framework from this comparative perspective?
Thank you for the question. Well, I choose the elements that I was restricted only to some aspect of the private law. What I could say is just that the fictio is a mechanism that, for my actual knowledge, it was really created in the Roman law system. So I don't think that they borrowed from other tradition, or it was a very sophisticated system and a very sophisticated mechanism that the praetor created in the trial per formulas. I haven't found any reference to the fictio in the book of Manu, but perhaps they are, and I have to check it more carefully, or maybe there could be something, because the contract law, for what I observed, have a great development with the post-Vedic the post-Vedic books. I think that in the Manus Code, he gives just the footsteps, but then he focuses more on the traditional aspects of civil law, and also the one that were more related to religion, such as personal law, succession law. So it was really hard to find topics that were not permeable to the religious influence.
Okay.
That's why I choose the interest in maritime law, because this is just an economical matter. It is not influenced by any other, or also in the area of the recognize of the debt.
But I mean, especially economy usually transgresses traditional boundaries, and especially in economic law of Roman times, we find quite many modifications already in the Republic, but then especially in the imperial period. So I think if there's also no finding on the other side, this tells something about how systems can adapt or not. Or?
No, yeah, I will I will point out as well. This you know that the disciplinary sector of Italy is Roman law and the laws of antiquities, while everyone is always it doesn't go over the borders of Roman law. So there are many other aspects. You can make what I did with all aspects of private law by comparing Roman and Indian.
So have you looked at the religious laws then? Have you made any comparisons at all in your, just when you did this research, as a sort of side note for yourself, for aspects of religious law in Rome, in the Roman tradition and the Indian tradition? Have you made any observations at all there?
Well, beside the fact, but this is really complex, because the theories are too much. So I think that where you can find the more interesting juxtaposition is religious and is between use and dharma, as I started, but it was a really difficult topic. So I stayed just in the surface of it, I have to admit. I didn't, because I wanted to find something related only to law. So.
And how about previous research on this topic, comparison of secular law between India and Rome? How much previous research is there? Is there any?
No, this is my first research about India.
Yeah, but I was talking about the research in general. I mean, how much research is there in
wow, really few and very specific. I found just some doctrine about they especially focuses about the comparison between 12 tables and the Dharmasutras, not the Book of Manu. And this is I cannot find a reason, because I think that Book of Manu is a gold mine, mine for. And then I found also quite few pieces of doctrine about the concept of nature and the jus naturalis, the category of jus naturalis, because this gives up much open and wider reflections. Well, there is also the problem of the translation, because I don't know Sanskrit. I have to give faith to the translation. For example, there is in the case of the interest of maritime law, the Dharma, in the fragment of the Book of Manu, when he says twice of much the depth, it can be argued that it's twice of much of the fine and not the depth. But I made a comparative research, and I verified that it was typical for in the Code of Manu always to say directly the amount of money for the fine, even if the double. So the twice of much, I compared many translations, and I'm quite sure that it is referred directly on the depth, is twice depth and not twice the fine. But this can be debatable also. it should be nice to go directly on the Sanskrit source, and maybe someone of you who knows Sanskrit can help me with this passage.
Well, if you send in this final version of the paper for the conference publication, we can I can help you have them checked. I know a few persons who are much better at Sanskrit than me, so they can look up the originals, check them, and just to check your interpretation. So it's possible. So keep it in mind and have prepare the final version in a few months, so you can look at it then. And you had some in chat. Sven and Andrea put some suggestions for you in the chat as well. So look them up.
Yes, thank you, Professor.
Yeah. All right. Any more questions? Otherwise, I thought this was, I mean, a really interesting topic, which I didn't know that much about myself from beforehand, but it gave a good first taster, so to speak, into comparative law between India and Rome. It would be also interesting. It's not your field, of course, but somehow, sometime hear someone speaking about comparative law between Greece and India. That would also be cool.
Oh, well, yeah, yes. Well,
maybe in the second.
As I told you, the Fenus Nauticum it comes directly from the Greek tradition. We have tons of documents who testify the maritime contract directly in Greece. So yeah, you can do this triangle comparison also.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Shall we take 1 hour's lunch break and then return for the afternoon sessions after that? I'll leave the room open again, so there's no need to exit if you don't like to.